What if everything you rely on suddenly disappeared? No power, no roads, no stores, no warm bed waiting for you at night. Just forest, wind, hunger, and the sound of your own breathing in the dark. There was a time when survival meant something very different. Back then, a man could not afford to be careless, soft, or distracted. If he did not know the land, the weather, the fire, the water, and the animal trails, the wilderness would bury him without a sound. When most people picture the American frontier, they imagine rifles, wagons, log cabins, and wide-open country. But what most people don't realize is that the frontier was not won by courage alone. It was survived by memory, by discipline, and by hundreds of small skills passed from one set of hands to the next. Skills learned from older hunters, trappers, scouts, farm wives, woodsmen, and often from native people who had understood the land for generations long before any frontiersmen stepped into it. This wasn't romantic. It was exhausting. It was cold. It was wet boots, split knuckles, empty stomachs, and nights when one bad choice meant you never saw morning. And the strangest part is this: many of the things that kept those people alive are barely remembered now. 100 years ago, wilderness skill was still close to daily life in North America. As the National Park Service notes, in reflecting on older backcountry life, survival used to be simple and harsh. It was your responsibility, and people learned or they died. So tonight, we're stepping back into that older world, not the legend, not the postcard, the real thing. 25 survival skills that once meant the difference between making it home or becoming another story the woods kept to itself. And if you stay with me until the end, you'll understand why modern people, for all our comfort, would fail faster than we like to admit. 1. Finding water by reading the land. Back then, a thirsty man did not wander blindly and hope for luck. He read the land. He looked for the fold of a valley, the green seam of willow, the place where flies thickened and birds kept dropping low at dusk. A frontiersman knew that water usually collected where the world bent inward, at the base of slopes, in shaded hollows, near cottonwoods, in game-worn draws, where animals had already done the scouting for him. A good woodsman could look at a hillside and know which side would hold damp ground longer after the sun crossed over. He knew that even when a creek was hidden, the land often whispered its location first. The air cooled. The mud darkened. Tracks multiplied. This wasn't just a skill. It was survival. A man can go hungry longer than he can go dry. And once he found water, that was only the beginning. 2. Reading weather without a forecast. The frontiersman carried no weather report in his pocket. The sky was the report. The wind was the report. Even the smell of the air could become a warning. He learned to notice when the birds flew low and restless, when smoke refused to rise, when clouds stopped looking soft and began stacking into hard, moving walls. He watched the sunset for a red haze that meant dry weather, or a dull, swollen horizon that meant rain was marching in. He felt pressure changes in old injuries, in stiff fingers, in the mood of horses and dogs. What most people don't realize is that weather on the frontier didn't simply make life uncomfortable. It ruined powder. It swelled rivers. It soaked bedding. It turned trails into traps and cold into a killer. A frontiersman did not just observe the weather. He negotiated with it. And if he got that negotiation wrong, the next skill became urgent. 3. Making fire from what the forest gave you. A modern person thinks of fire as a convenience. A frontiersman knew it as shelter, medicine, light, dry clothing, hot food, and morale. Lose the fire, and everything else began to collapse. So he learned where dry tinder hid even after rain. In the shredded bark under a standing dead tree. In the heartwood of fat pine. In old bird nests tucked under roots. In cedar bark, fungus, dry grass carried in the lining of his possibles bag. He learned to split wood instead of gathering it whole, because the outside might be soaked while the inside stayed dry and pale as bone. This skill was half patience and half stubbornness. He didn't curse the wet. He worked around it, piece by piece. Shaving curls, protecting the spark from wind, building small before building big. A careless fire died fast. A careful one became the center of camp, and sometimes the difference between life and death. But wait, it gets even more intense because starting a fire was one thing. Starting it the old way was another. 4. Striking fire with flint, steel, and char. Before matches became common, one of the surest ways to make fire was flint, steel, and char cloth. It looked simple from a distance. One sharp strike, one orange spark. But in cold hands, in wind, in damp country, it became an art. A frontiersman would catch that spark on charred cloth, then fold it into a nest of tinder and breathe life into it slowly, almost tenderly, until smoke became glow and glow became flame. The motion had to be practiced enough that he could do it tired, hungry, or frightened, because that is exactly when he would need it most. Arkansas State Parks notes that skill with striker, flint, and char cloth was essential before modern lighters because it made quick daily fire possible. That word matters, daily. This was not a trick. It was a basic condition of living. And once a man had fire, he guarded it like treasure. 5. Carrying yesterday's fire into tomorrow. What most people don't realize is that sometimes the smartest way to start a fire was not to start one at all. It was to keep one alive. Frontiersmen often banked coals deep in ash before sleep, or carried a slow ember inside punky wood, fungus, or dry rotten material that would smolder for hours without open flame. In camp, this saved time. On the move, it saved energy. And in ugly weather, it could save your life. Imagine a cold dawn after sleet. Your fingers are wooden, your tinder is poor, you're weak from yesterday's miles. If you have to begin from nothing, you may fail. But if one coal still lives under gray ash, you are not starting over. You are continuing. It sounds like a small thing. That is exactly why it mattered so much. 6. Building shelter in minutes, not hours. The frontier punished people who waited too long to make camp. A man who kept walking after dark, hoping for better ground, often bought himself a colder night than he could afford. So frontiersmen learned speed. A lean-to against the wind, a bed tucked under a fallen tree, bark laid over poles, spruce boughs stacked thick enough to block the ground's hunger for body heat. In winter, even a crude brush wall behind a fire could change everything. It didn't have to be pretty. It had to work before your hands stopped obeying you. Back then, shelter meant thinking like weather. Where is the wind coming from? What direction will the cold settle? Will rain run toward me by midnight? A good shelter wasn't built from strength. It was built from noticing. And that brings us to something even more forgotten than shelter itself. 7. Sleeping warm by not touching the earth. Most people think the danger of a cold night is the air. Often it's the ground. A frontiersman knew that the earth would steal heat from him hour after hour until strength ran out of his body. So he built bedding before he built comfort. Pine boughs, dry grass, leaves, buffalo robes in the plains, anything that lifted him up and trapped air underneath. A man could survive with a poor blanket and a good bed better than with a good blanket and bare ground. That lesson sounds simple now. It was paid for then in fever, stiffness, and nights that ended in frostbite. The old woodsman understood insulation long before most people ever used the word. And if they had to move before dawn, they needed to know exactly where they were going. 8. Blazing trails and remembering a country by trees. The frontier was not empty. It was confusing. One ridge looked like another. One creek bend mimicked the last. Without roads, a man could vanish inside familiar country if he stopped paying attention. So he learned to mark a route. A blaze cut on the bark, a broken branch turned in a certain way, a pile of stones where timber gave out. Not too much. Not enough to advertise carelessness. Just enough to find the path again, or to guide a companion behind him. A historic U.S. Forest Trail handbook describes blazes placed so travelers could see them from either direction, with markers especially important near fords, openings, and places of doubt. That phrase says everything, places of doubt. The frontier was full of them. And sometimes even a marked trail could not save you if you failed to read what moved across it. 9. Tracking more than footprints. A frontiersman did not just look down and see tracks. He saw time. He saw direction. He saw fear, injury, speed, and purpose. A bent blade of grass, mud drying at the edge of a print, a heel dug deeper than a toe, deer moving calm, deer suddenly running, a horse that had passed weighted down on one side, a person who stopped, turned, or hid. This was a language, and the wilderness was always speaking it. For hunters, tracking meant meat. For scouts, it meant warning. For families pushing west, it sometimes meant knowing whether strangers had passed before them and whether that should ease their minds or sharpen them. This wasn't just a survival skill. It was situational awareness in its oldest form. And once you could read sign, you had to learn how not to leave too much of your own. 10. Moving quietly through the woods. There was a certain way old woodsmen moved, slow through brush, fast through open ground, with weight placed carefully and eyes always 3 steps ahead. They did not stomp. They rolled the foot. They listened before they crossed. They chose shadow over skyline. Buckskin moccasins and soft-soled footwear helped, but the real skill was in the body. A man who hunted for years learned to stop breaking twigs, stop brushing bark, stop fighting the woods, and begin passing through it. This mattered for hunting, yes, but also for danger. A careless traveler announced himself to animals, strangers, and sometimes enemies long before he knew they were near. Modern people are loud in the wild because we assume noise has no cost. Back then, it often did. And if the rifle failed or powder ran low, the next skills mattered even more. 11. Catching food while you slept. A frontiersman knew that hunting was uncertain. Traps worked while he chopped wood, cleaned game, or rested sore legs. Simple snares for rabbits and small game. Deadfalls were legal and practical, baited lines, funnel traps, and set poles on streams. These methods were quiet, efficient, and patient. They turned a piece of wilderness into something that kept working after dark. A hungry family could not depend on dramatic hunts alone. They survived on repetition, on many chances, on small victories added together. This is what modern people often misunderstand about old survival. It was rarely heroic. It was systematic. It meant stacking the odds a little in your favor, then a little more, then a little more again. And if the woods did not give enough, the water usually still had something left. 12. Fishing with lines, weirs, and timing. The old frontiersmen knew that rivers and creeks were not just obstacles. They were pantries. A man could set a nightline and check it at dawn. He could build a crude fish trap in the right narrow flow. He could spear by torchlight in clear shallows or jig through winter ice where the cold allowed. The trick was not just the method, it was timing. After rain, at dusk, in spawning runs, in shaded pools beneath undercut banks. Fish did not shout their location. The water had to be read just like a trail or a cloud bank. And when that reading was right, it could mean protein with far less wasted energy than chasing game over miles of broken country. But here's where things get even more intense, because catching food was one skill. Carrying food through lean weeks was another. 13. Living on parched corn. Parched corn sounds humble because it is humble. That was its strength. Kernels dried hard, sometimes pounded, sometimes carried loose in a pouch, could be eaten dry, softened in water, or boiled into something like a quick meal. It traveled light, it kept well, it asked almost nothing from the man carrying it. A frontiersman might not love it, but he respected it. Back then, food wasn't judged by comfort first. It was judged by shelf life, weight, and usefulness in bad conditions. A handful of grain that kept you walking another 10 miles was worth more than a feast you couldn't carry. And when men moved deeper into trapping country, they relied on something even denser. 14. Surviving on pemmican. If parched corn was practical, pemmican was power. Made from dried meat and fat, sometimes with dried berries mixed in, it was one of the great survival foods of North American frontier life. It stored well when kept dry. It carried immense calories for its size. It could be eaten cold, sliced into stews, or used when no fresh meat could be found. The North Dakota State Museum describes pemmican as a dried meat and fat food that helped drive the fur trade because every pound carried enormous, shelf-stable nutrition. This wasn't luxury. It was concentrated endurance. Men could cross hard country on it. Trappers could winter on it. Expeditions could keep moving because someone, somewhere, had already done the hard work of preserving food the old way. And that old way extended far beyond meat. 15. Turning flour, water, and grease into a meal. A frontier meal often came down to what could be made fast with almost nothing. Ash cakes baked near coals. Simple hoe cakes. Dumplings in a pot. Cornmeal stretched into enough to quiet the belly. Grease saved from yesterday's animal, becoming the difference between dry paste and food with strength in it. What most people don't realize is how often survival depended on cooking skill, not just hunting skill. If you wasted flour, spoiled fat, scorched the pot, or burned precious fuel, you were not just making a bad supper. You were stealing from tomorrow. The frontier cook, often a woman, sometimes a trapper, sometimes whoever was least tired, kept people alive by making plain food count. And that required another forgotten ability. 16. Using every part of an animal. A modern hunter may talk about harvest. A frontiersman talked about waste as a kind of sin. Meat was only the beginning. Fat was rendered into tallow. Bones were cracked for marrow. Sinew became cordage and thread. Hide became clothing, bags, lashings, or rawhide. Hooves, horns, scraps, all had a second life if the need was real enough. In hard country, the animal did not simply feed you once. It entered your camp as a whole bundle of future uses. This is where things take a darker turn, because the frontier taught a brutal economy. If something could keep you warm, patch your shelter, mend your moccasin, or boil into broth, you did not throw it aside. Comfort wastes, survival repurposes, and few materials mattered more than hide. 17. Making buckskin and wearing the land itself. Buckskin wasn't just frontier clothing. It was mobile shelter, soft, quiet, warm when dry, and durable when properly made. Buckskin became a second skin for hunters and travelers. It moved through brush better than many woven cloths and could be repaired again and again in camp. The Autry Museum notes that buckskin hunting clothing was widely worn by explorers, trappers, and hunters in the late 18th century into the 1840s, blending Native American and European styles because practical frontier clothing had to answer the weather first. But clothing like that did not appear by magic. Someone had to tan the hide, soften it, smoke it, work it by hand until it stopped being skin and became material. This wasn't fashion. This was labor turned into warmth. And when true leather wasn't available, the frontier had a harsher answer. 18. Repairing the world with rawhide. Rawhide was stiff, stubborn, and unbelievably useful. A strip of it, wetted and wrapped tight, could mend gear, lash a broken frame, fix a handle, secure a pack, even patch emergency problems that would otherwise end a journey. When it dried, it tightened like a vise. That made it perfect for field repairs, when iron, nails, or spare parts were nowhere to be found. Imagine a wagon miles from settlement, or a trapper with a broken snowshoe, or a hunter whose knife sheath tears open in sleet. Rawhide was not elegant, but it bought time. And time on the frontier was everything. Time to reach shelter. Time to reach people. Time to avoid becoming a man who lay down just for an hour and never got back up. And sometimes what failed first wasn't gear. It was the body. 19. Knowing the woods as a medicine chest. Frontier medicine could be rough, limited, and sometimes wrong. But old woodsmen still learned a working knowledge of the land's remedies because there was often no doctor close enough to matter. Spruce gum or resin could be used in salves and practical remedies. Willow bark was known for easing pain. Clean moss, cloth, pressure, and rest mattered more than dramatic cures. A deep cut, an infected blister, a broken tooth, a fever in the wrong season. Any one of them could turn deadly far from help. Northern Woodlands notes that spruce gum had a long history of practical and medicinal use, including treatment for skin irritations and sores. This wasn't frontier superstition at its best. It was necessity. Use what the land gave you and pray it was enough. But medicine alone never saved people who let their tools go to ruin. 20. Sewing leather, cloth, and flesh value gear. The old frontier was held together by mending. A torn hunting shirt, a split seam in a powder pouch, a blown-out moccasin, a horse blanket ripped at the corner. Frontiersmen and frontier women both knew the awl, the needle, the thong, the sinew thread. Repair happened at night by firelight because the next day depended on it. What most people don't realize is that gear failure often begins in tiny places. One loose stitch becomes a bigger tear. One hole in a shoe becomes wet feet. Wet feet become slow walking. Slow walking becomes getting caught out in the dark. That is how the frontier worked. Little neglects growing into big trouble. And no place punished miscalculation faster than moving water. 21. Crossing rivers without dying in them. A river on the frontier was never just a river. It was cold shock, hidden holes, slick stones, current that looked weak until it hit your knees, and the possibility of losing your powder, your food, your horse, or your child in one bad crossing. Old frontiersmen learned to look for fords, to study the color of the water, to judge the width against the speed, to cross at angles, to loosen loads so they could be dropped if necessary. This is one of those skills modern people underestimate because we are used to bridges. Back then, a river could end an entire journey. Wagons tipped, animals panicked, feet slipped. Men were swept under where the current folded back on itself. The wise did not fight rivers with pride. They negotiated with them like they did weather, carefully and without haste. And in winter, water became something even more dangerous. 22. Knowing cold well enough to fear it properly. Cold does not always attack in a dramatic way. Sometimes it enters quietly. Numb fingers. Slower thoughts. A strange calm. The desire to stop moving just for a moment. Frontiersmen feared winter because they knew it lied. Snow could hide a trail, preserve tracks, reveal tracks, deaden sound, and reflect moonlight enough to help a man travel. But it could also kill by inches. The skilled learned how to layer bedding, dry socks by embers, keep sweat down while walking, and recognize that wet wool in wind was more dangerous than darkness. Most people today would fail at this point because we are used to treating cold like discomfort. The frontier treated it like a predator. Once it got inside the body, it made people foolish. And foolishness in winter is often the beginning of the end. Unless, of course, you had already prepared for the lean season. 23. Hiding food before hunger found you. A cache was a promise to your future self. Frontiersmen hid dried meat, grain, powder, tools, and trade goods in pits, high boxes, sealed containers, or tucked places above flood and below notice. In trapping country, a cache could mean the difference between returning to provisions or returning to emptiness. Around settlements, it could protect food from moisture, animals, and theft. This is where long-term survival separated itself from mere toughness. The strong man might push hard for a week. The wise man prepared for the month he could not control. He thought ahead to snow, flood, poor hunting, injury, or delay. He knew that the body breaks down fast when hope runs on memory alone. And you won't believe what mattered just as much as storing food, storing judgment. 24. Rationing without panic. Hunger makes people stupid. That is one of the oldest truths in survival. A frontiersman understood that a pouch of meal or a strip of dried meat was not simply food. It was time. Eat too much on the first hard day, and you rob the fifth day. Refuse to eat enough when you should, and weakness catches you early. So men learned rationing, quiet, disciplined, sometimes miserable rationing. Back then, there were long stretches when nobody came to save you. No relief truck, no quick resupply. Your pace, your mood, your clarity of mind all began to orbit what remained in your bag. The men and women who survived hardest country were not always the boldest. Often they were the least wasteful. And that leads us to the final skill, the one that may have saved more frontier lives than any trap, rifle, or fire ever did. 25. Knowing when to turn back. This wasn't just a skill, it was survival in its purest form. The last generation of true frontiersmen learned something modern people hate to hear. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stop. Turn back before the pass closes. Camp early before the storm hits. Leave the elk trail and return to your family alive. Admit the river is too high. Admit the horse is too tired. Admit your hands are too numb to keep going safely. The frontier killed proud men every year. Men who had almost enough strength, almost enough daylight, almost enough food, almost enough luck. Survival was not about being fearless. It was about respecting limits before the land forced them on you. So, when we talk about the forgotten skills of the frontier, maybe this is the one we have lost most completely. Not fire, not tracking, not trapping, judgment. The calm ability to say, not today. To live another day by refusing to die for stubbornness. Back then, survival meant something very different. It meant reading clouds like a language, finding water by the bend of the ground, carrying fire as if it were gold, sleeping on boughs above frozen earth, stitching your clothes, your gear, and your future back together by hand. It meant eating plain food without complaint, wasting nothing, and learning, sometimes from elders, sometimes from neighbors, often from native knowledge of the land, how to belong to a hard country long enough to outlast it. What most people don't realize is that these weren't exotic skills. They were ordinary skills in an unforgiving world. That's what makes them so haunting. The last generation of frontiersmen didn't think of themselves as performing history. They were just trying to make it through another winter, another river crossing, another night with enough firewood and enough sense to see dawn. And maybe that's why these old abilities still matter to us now. Because underneath all our comfort, the truth hasn't changed. If the systems failed, if the lights went out, if the roads closed and help stopped coming, human survival would become very old-fashioned, very fast. So here's the question I'll leave you with tonight. Could you survive if all of this came back tomorrow? If you enjoyed this journey into forgotten survival history, subscribe to the channel, like the video, and tell me in the comments which one of these 25 skills you think modern people have lost the most completely. And if you want, I'll make a follow-up on the frontier winter skills that were even harsher than these.